He is a baba to bum 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 bum. Books. Dean Hideous, Unleash This, book reviews. Every Saturday, except I almost never seem to get them out on Saturday anymore because today's Monday, day after Christmas Eve. Hope your holidays were great. Christmas songs gonna be stuck in my head for a few more weeks, probably, but Santa treated me well, stocked me up for my trip to California. I got some plane tickets. I'm flying. Whether or not next week there'll be a book review is still up in the air. It's up for grabs. We'll see. I thought I brought a notebook up here. Shoot, did I leave it? Here. Where's my notebook? Where's my notebook? Where's my notebook? Where's my notebook? It was right here all along. Found my notebook. It was right here all along. This week, for the first time in a while, I needed to take notes because we have a book that's a little more complicated than I've read in a while. Talking about David Foster Wallace's interviews with hideous men. Brief interviews with hideous men. Yeah. I kind of debated how I was going to go about taking on this review today. Thought I'd give you a sort of brief summary on some of my favorite short stories in the collection, a little bit on why I like them, and kind of throw in here and there how they reflect David Foster Wallace in his writing as a whole. So, the book kicks off with a 2-paragraph long little thing. I almost still want to call it like flash fiction or something, one of those trendy words, because it still tells a little mini story. It's not like, what do they call them, epitaphs or something like that. It actually is a brief mini story called A Radically Condensed History of Post-Industrial Life, and I hope you can forgive me for having to write that down, because it's a long title. But this story probably hit me the hardest out of all of them. Its brevity allows it to stick into your head, and I've now noticed 2 or 3 times where I've been paying attention to a life situation and this clicks and hits me. And since it's so short, I don't want to ruin it for you and tell you what it says or what it means or anything like that. It's 2 paragraphs long. If you follow me on Twitter at Unleashing Words, I'm going to take a picture of it and post it on Twitter so you guys can check it out, okay? One of the staples of this collection is something that he calls, and the title of the book comes from it, Brief Interviews with Hideous Men. And I think there's 3, maybe 4 sections in the book of these brief interviews. And what they basically are just small little sections of somebody telling what is most of the time a little story that has something to do with their sexual nature. And what I got from it, I believe they are all men. And all the questions that the interviewer asks the interviewee are reduced to just the letter Q. So what Foster Wallace does here is, rather than fill us with unnecessary words and fluff as far as the questions are, he assumes, due to our lives of growing up and seeing so many interviews, that we can fill in these holes for ourselves. So, you just have the cue there, and the real emphasis is placed on the answers that the person gives. And what you get here is some really deep insight into man's psyche, some stuff that you kind of always knew was true, or maybe when you read it you realize could very possibly be true, but for whatever reason it's stuff that we try to hide and put in the shadows and not really discuss and talk about. And the reasons why we do that kind of stuff could lead to discussions that last for hours, but the intensity that Wallace gives us these stories with really kind of hits us with it, or at least me, with an oomph of truth. Of, yeah, this is really how it is. A darker side to man, not too twisted, but dark enough that you realize is actually there. Yeah. In case you can tell, I kind of have trouble talking about Wallace because he's an artist that just, for me, at this point in my life, and maybe someday it'll change, is just that notch higher than a lot of other authors. And so trying to completely come to terms with it and understand it and wrap my head around it is a lot harder than your average everyday fiction. It's harder for me to put it into words, so I hope you understand that as I talk about it. Anyways, next section. He writes this story about climbing a diving board and just about jumping into the pool, but all the time in between, climbing each rung, standing at the top, feeling like time is frozen, suddenly having everything click and realize time didn't freeze and people are waiting and yelling at you to jump, to jump, to jump. And what this really gets into is the anxiety and depression that David Foster Wallace really was known for, and the reason he did take his own life. And what we see here is the extreme analysis of every minute detail that Wallace just couldn't help but perceive. You notice here in a lot of his writings that he goes on and on and on and on about details that are so unimportant and repeats them over and over too, to the point of almost irritation, where you're just saying, get to the point and let me know what happens next. But you learn to realize that this is who David Foster Wallace was as a person. This is just how he perceived things. He was always stuck in his head. He couldn't get out of perceiving things and analyzing them over and over and over. And if you ever get to reading Infinite Jest, or if you have read Infinite Jest, there's a lot of details in that book too about this. And one point I remember from that book that really hit me was how sometimes your mind can become a labyrinth where you think and think and think until you get stuck in the middle of it and you can't find a way out, and you're trapped in this constant stream of thinking that you just want to get away from, but it's impossible to do so. And I think the reason why David Foster Wallace hits me so hard with this type of stuff is that I see myself in that too. Not to the extreme of his genius, of his depression, of his anxiety. Obviously, the guy above and beyond what your average everyday guy like you or me feels, but we do feel it to some extent. And so when you see him discuss it, some man that really does have a grasp on it because he lives it to such an extreme past what you or I live it, it really resonates with us, because it's those type of things that you feel inside, but you're never able to express. He can express it. Read the short story about climbing a ladder and waiting on the diving board, and you'll see exactly what I mean. One of the hardest series, though, in this book here, I guess if you want to call it a series, although altogether it was still considered just one short story, was called Octet. And Octet was originally planned to be 8 little mini stories within the one story that we're supposed to hit and tell an overall feeling, an overall question that Foster had about humanity. But what he ends up writing is just 4. He's only able to pull off 4 before he realizes it's just taking way too much time and effort and stress. And in his last one, what he develops is almost a plea or a call to us to understand why he couldn't get 8 out, why there's only 4 here, and really works at writing in a way that I've never seen before. And he says it. He works it out. It's like his mind is spilling out onto the paper, works it out right in front of you. A sort of meta fiction here, which by my brief understanding of metafiction is when an author writes a story with giving the reader the understanding that the author is expressing that he knows that he's writing the story, blah blah blah, and I just lose myself. Man, it's tough talking about David Foster Wallace. Okay, anyways, if you're looking to get into the guy, I say give this one a shot if you've never read anything before, but understand that it's going to take some work and effort on your part. Not in the matter of research or looking online for synopsis of understanding what's going on in the story, but more just having to work your mind around the way that he writes and the way that he develops his fiction. It is different. for me, it just sort of clicked at one point, and that was during Infinite Jest. So when I did read this book right away, I was understanding everything, but I could very easily see if this would have been my first venture into the author that I may have been confused for the first few short stories. So don't go into this thinking it's going to be a breeze. You're probably going to have to work at it if you've never tried him out before. If you have tried some of his other work, it's not going to disappoint, but you probably already knew that. Dean Gornitis, Unleash This Book Reviews, stumbling on my words like I haven't in months. David Foster Wallace, Brief Interviews with Hideous Men. See you next week.